Welcome back to this informational video series on the Manhattan Development Code. Well, wait a minute. That's better. Welcome back to this video series on the Manhattan Development Code. It's been a while. This video covers Article 7, which covers the topics of site development standards. These are standards applied to individual sites when they're developed or go through substantial improvements. In this video, we're going to go over things like parking, landscaping, signage, lighting, and some general miscellaneous things. We've got a lot to cover, so let's dive in. So first I want to cover parking. This is probably one of the more revolutionary divisions based on how we've handled parking in the past. I talked a little bit about it in my video over Article 4. But there's several reasons why we approached parking the way we did in the MDC. One, we found that in the past, we've been requiring way too much parking. Developers would express how much parking was going unused, and most of the time they would just barely meet that minimum because that's the most that they actually needed. Number two, parking is expensive. One space alone can cost anywhere between $1,000 and $10,000 to construct and hundreds of dollars per year to maintain. This ultimately affects affordability, especially for residential development and certainly commercial development. Number three, parking takes up a lot of space. That space that parking takes up, especially the parking that goes unused, could be used for a business or homes or green space. Number four, parking takes away from the quality of the urban environment. I think we can all agree that parking lots are pretty harsh, boring environments that take up the place of potentially walkable spaces with a lot more character. I can't think of anyone who wants to hang out in a parking lot on purpose. Hi, post-production Ben here. I just wanted to add that parking is also a pretty huge drain on resources. Too much of it can really bloat cities, creating these placeless, sprawling environments that require us to continue to stretch out very expensive tax-funded infrastructure like roads, sewer, water, and stormwater lines. Also, parking surfaces are almost always impermeable surfaces, and too much of them can really lead to flooding and water quality issues. I just forgot to add that yesterday, so I wanted to throw it in here today. Okay, sorry. Lastly, we're finding an interesting trend among renters in Manhattan, which make up over half of the population here. We're finding they're becoming less and less car dependent. This is reflected in the number of cars owned by renter households, which is currently decreasing, and the number of renter households without cars, which is increasing. So with all that said, we really wanted to drop the minimum parking requirement and make it a true minimum that actually creates a base load of parking that would actually be utilized. So across the board, we've reduced our parking minimums by about half for commercial uses. For residential uses, there was a bit of a less drastic shift. The main change being that we reduced the minimum to one space per bedroom for general multifamily, which is down from a system by which your parking requirement is determined by the number of bedrooms within a development. So for an apples to apples comparison, we can take a 20-unit apartment building, and let's assume that all the units in the apartment building had an equal number of 1, 2, 3, and 4 bedroom units. So today we would require 62 spaces for that apartment. With this new minimum that we apply, only 50 spaces would be required. So not a huge shift, but it is a number that is more defensible and based on evidence that's out there. And so for all the reasons I talked about why too much parking can be a bad thing, we're also introducing parking maximums. Now, this is mostly aimed at those larger big box stores which tend to way oversupply parking to the point where it becomes a public interest to actually limit the amount of parking that it supplies due to the environmental impacts and, frankly, inefficient use of space. So the goal of this was to set a very high bar for those maximums and to create a very low bar for those minimums and give more discretion to the developer in how much parking they would actually need. So every land use in the MDC has a respective parking minimum and maximum that can be found in the table in section 26-7B-3. So look through that if you're interested in what the parking requirement would be for a specific use. And I know what you're thinking, but Ben, what happens when a building with a retail store is converted into office spaces? Good question, Ben. Well, with our old code, if a land use changed from a use with a lower parking requirement to a use with a higher parking requirement, they would actually have to add more spaces to meet the new minimum or ask for an exception. And as you can imagine, this does not help commercial development adapt. It just ends up in a situation where the most common denominator is a lot of parking. So in the new code, we're going to be a lot more flexible by saying if the new use exceeds twice that of what's available on the site, that's the point where you actually have to supply the parking. If the new use doesn't require that much parking, then you don't have to meet the new minimum. So that should remove one major barrier to development adaptation. Oh, and we're also recognizing compact parking spaces by allowing up to 10% of parking spaces supplied to be reserved for compact cars. Bike parking requirements are next. We have some isolated requirements for bike parking right now, but we will be requiring it more broadly through the MDC. Over the past few years, we've continued to see bike culture and biking as a form of transportation trend upward in Manhattan. Some quick facts: our mileage of bike infrastructure, including bike lanes, bike boulevards, and trails, has actually tripled since 2008. We've been a bronze level bike-friendly community since 2012, and about 2.5% of Manhattan citizens bike to work every day, which is actually 3 times the national average. One local study showed that about half of all K-State students own a bike, and about 13% of K-State students bike daily. So there's a lot of people biking in Manhattan, and that won't be going away anytime soon. And I can also get into why biking is so healthy, economic, green, and makes cities more desirable, and why we should be striving for that, but we don't have time to get into that. All you want to know is what's going to be required, right? Well, you'll see it detailed in table 26-7B-4 that generally for residential development with more than 4 dwelling units, we require 1 space for every 2 bedrooms, which is equal to 1 rack for every 4 bedrooms. For commercial and other non-residential, it's a function of how many car parking spaces are provided, and it's equal to 5% of that car parking. So say I have a store and I provide 200 parking spaces, that would mean I need to have 10 bike parking spaces or 5 racks. And I say racks because each rack counts as 2 spaces if it's designed correctly and spaced out correctly. And you betcha we have rack design standards. So a basic rack has to be an inverted U shape and meet these dimensional standards. And when placed next to each other, they each have to be spaced out a certain amount in the context of their site. They have to be so far away from each other and other obstructions. In the same way we have standards for parking lot design, we have them for bike parking to reduce conflicts and make sure those spaces are actually usable. Good segue. We're adapting our parking lot design standards into this new code. They aren't changing a lot from what we have today. We mostly just transcribe them into this handy table and diagram for easier understanding. But the basics are it provides minimums for size standards in terms of aisle widths, stall lengths, and stall widths so that you don't get into a fender bender in a parking lot. We're also introducing standards for electric vehicle charging stations and parking lots. We're starting to see a lot more EVs on the road, and it's becoming a lot more common to see charging stations at places where we park so that you can charge your car while you shop. So we're simply allowing them as accessory to parking spaces everywhere, but there are some simple regulations to ensure that they aren't emitting excessive light or sound and make sure they're not creating an obstruction for cars or people. On to drive-through design. We can probably all think of a certain restaurant or purveyor of beverages that have excessively long drive-through lines that end up spilling into the street, creating a pretty clear safety hazard for other drivers. So we're introducing design standards for drive-throughs to make sure that they are long enough to provide adequate stacking of cars and to minimize conflicts with adjacent streets. Also with parking, we're introducing a concept of shared parking. So since certain land uses like office, retail, and residential all have different demands for parking during different times of the day, we're allowing development to account for that in their parking requirement. So because offices demand more parking in the morning and afternoons, and residential uses are more demanding of parking in the evenings and nights, there's opportunity for one to utilize space when the other really doesn't need it. And table 26-7B-13.1 shows you how we would be able to reduce parking requirements to account for that. Lastly, this section references landscaping requirements for parking lots, requirements that we largely have today but are located in the landscaping section of this article. Another good segue, Ben. Thank you. Landscaping. This is a very expanded topic in the MDC because landscaping and landscape open spaces provide many benefits, including energy conservation, increased property values, and enhanced aesthetic quality. Landscaping could also be used as a buffer between land uses and screening of gross stuff. It reduces heat generated from paved surfaces, protects water quality and wildlife habitat, conserves topsoil, reduces flooding risk, just to name a few. And this is mostly going to apply to commercial developments, larger residential developments, and large parking lots, and only triggered for new development or redevelopment. So developments would submit a landscaping plan showing what their landscaping would look like. That way we could verify that they're meeting the minimums. And those minimums are spelled out in table 26-7C-7.1. And in most cases, you're going to have to supply a certain number of trees, shrubs, ornamental grasses, and perennials for development, each meeting a certain caliper or volume. Those parking lot landscaping requirements I talked about earlier also live in this section. Like I said, parking lots tend to be hot, barren, soul-sucking environments. So these standards soften those landscapes and humanize them a bit. Again, these are requirements that we largely have now, but with more detail and illustrations that make it clear on what's required. And it's pretty standard stuff. So much of the parking lot has to have landscaping islands within them. No parking space can be further than 70 feet from a tree. In some cases, parking lots have to be screened from adjacent streets using things like shrubs and berms and landscaping walls. One last thing on landscaping is the introduction of the concept of buffer yards. I mentioned earlier that these are spaces and landscaping features which can create a transition or screening or barrier between incompatible uses. So you'll see certain buffer yards required throughout the code. We've developed 3 types ranging from minimal buffering to maximum buffering, which will vary in width and density of plant materials and can be wider or narrower depending on if you include a fence. So one easy example is that we require buffer yards when certain less compatible zoning districts abut each other. As you can see by this table, the more incompatible the districts, the bigger the buffer yard. So a heavy industrial district abutting a light industrial district, not a big deal. That's a type A buffer yard. But if a heavy industrial district is next to a residential use, you best believe that is a large type C buffer yard. Again, because we want to create distance between those incompatible uses. Signage is also covered in this section. Signage is not changing substantially whatsoever. We updated our sign code just a few years ago, so there really wasn't a lot of work to be done here, aside from making sure we were following the latest in legal issues related to free speech and accommodating for some more recent developments in the cutting edge field of signs. But generally, signage you're allowed to have for a business, school, church, daycare, whatever it is, it's all here. The zoning district that you're in largely dictates the type of sign that you're allowed to have, from awning signs to monument signs, wall signs, pedestrian signs, and the maximum size, shape, height, and if that sign can be illuminated or animated, that kind of thing. So check out that section in the code for more information on signs. On to lighting. Our regulations on lighting have been mostly hands-off in the past, but there's a growing field of research surrounding how artificial lighting affects safety and well-being, and the effects of light pollution on our environment and health. But we tried to keep it simple here and just focus on lighting as more of a potential nuisance by reducing the impacts of outdoor lightings for adjacent properties. And to put it simply, you have to keep your light to yourself. You also can't have exposed, unshielded lighting that's open to the sky, meaning light doesn't directly illuminate an adjacent property and light bleed is minimized. There is, of course, a whole list of exempted light sources, ranging from ornamental and holiday lighting to my personal favorite, underwater lighting in swimming pools. Clear vision triangles are also talked about here. When you're approaching an intersection in a car and you look both ways to see if a car is coming, well, vision triangles ensure that properties located on corners don't put things in your way. Things like trees, fences, and signs that would obstruct your vision if you tried to pull forward or cross into traffic. How large that space is determined by the type of approach, be it an alley intersecting a street, a driveway intersecting a street, or a street intersecting a street. And you can see that in the illustration here. Not much changing there, but we did want to make it more visual and clearer on what was required when different roadways intersected each other. And that'll do it for Article 7. Again, site development standards that will apply to new development or substantial redevelopments. Our next video will cover Article 8, which will cover things like application review, procedures, and nonconformities. So thank you for watching.